The Gospel according to Luke, chapter 2, verses 1 to 7. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus, that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. And all went to be taxed, every one into his own city. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth into Judea, unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary his espoused wife, being great with child. And so it was, that while they were there, the days were accomplished, that she should be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. There endeth our reading. Thank you, Lord. Amen. In this first reading from chapter 2 of the Gospel of Luke, we are witness to the birth of Jesus Christ in Bethlehem. And in the Gospel of Luke, there are some historical details to give context to how Mary and her husband Joseph wound up in Bethlehem, travelling from Nazareth in Galilee, shortly thereafter arriving, Jesus being born. Now, just to mention first of all that the Nativity, the story of the birth of Christ, only appears in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, the Gospels of Mark and John, as we know, beginning with the baptism essentially of Jesus by John the Baptist. And the two nativity descriptions in Matthew and Luke share some overlap, but there are many differences as well. Now, in the Gospel of Luke, these first two verses, according to commentators, have created, as I think Charles Ellicott said, essentially unlimited discussion as to their accuracy. Scholars of Roman practice concerning these forms of taxation, and really, as we'll see shortly, it's not really taxation, it's a census, which could then be used for taxation. But much of the detail here doesn't fit in with historical precedent. That said, though, there isn't much history written, particularly in this period, particularly regarding the Holy Land, regarding Palestine. First of all, to clear up, the word taxed here that's been translated in the Greek has an equivalent meaning, which is to be registered, and that's essentially a census. So everyone needed to be registered so that the central authority in Rome would know how large their empire is, what the occupation of people was in the different parts of the empire, and what their net worth would be. And this would allow them later on to think about levels of tax. So, of course, not a popular process, but according to commentators, because Palestine was essentially ruled by the Herodian dynasty, it was actually exempt from this census in principle, did not pay taxes to Rome in principle, and therefore critics have said that there wouldn't be such a census carried out. On the other hand, counter critics defending this passage from Luke say that Herod was a puppet of the Roman state and would gladly fit in with common practice in the Roman Empire in order to curry favour with Caesar. The Caesar in this case being the first Caesar who was named emperor of the Roman Empire, namely Augustus, who was the nephew of Julius Caesar, and also the person from whom we get the month August. Such was his fame and power in the Roman Empire at that time. So we're not looking at this as taxation, we're looking at this as a census. Now, in the Roman Empire, when the census was carried out, generally people would be registered where they lived, not where maybe their family comes from or where they were born. And this is another criticism that is levelled at this account from Luke, because in principle, if Joseph and Mary were living in Nazareth, there'd be no need for them to travel to Bethlehem in a typical Roman census. But again, counter-critics point out that such a census would be extraordinarily unpopular with the Jewish people, and perhaps with Herod organising it, he made the pill less bitter to swallow if he essentially enforced the census along the lines of Jewish tribes and Jewish families, and maybe he had some propaganda about why that would be a good idea, and perhaps Jewish people would be quite willing to have a census of the tribes and families, because some tribes perhaps would do better out of that than others. So the reason that there's no final answer with these questions is that there's just no historical record. There were historians writing at the time, but very little attention paid to Palestine in these particular days. Now, verse 2 is also highly criticized because Cyrenius was governor of Syria starting in 6 AD. And the way that we read verse 2, it seems to imply that prior to the census that's being ordered in Palestine, a first such census was carried out in that sort of part of the world by Cyrenius earlier on. Now, Cyrenius was a Roman aristocrat who became very powerful, curried favour with the Caesars, and indeed was governor of Syria after AD 6, but he'd been in the region for well over a decade prior to that, in various levels of administration. Cyrenius is his Greek form of his name. His original Roman name was Quirinius, I believe, if I can read my scribbled handwriting there. So the argument that I've been reading, that is the counter-argument from biblical scholars who essentially want to insist on the accuracy of Luke, and of course the reason they want to insist on the accuracy of Luke is that if these historical details are proven wrong, everything can be questioned. So the counter argument is that Cyrenius was in the region for more than a decade in high levels of administration, and may have had in Syria a senior role that could be thought of as a governor role. Certainly could have ordered some form of census, perhaps essentially following orders from Augustus or from Julius Caesar prior. Another counter-argument is that the naming of him as Cyrenius, governor of Syria, is just a form of address of him that most people would be familiar with, even though he may not have been governor of Syria at that time. Now, I'm sure that the idea that I've had exists out there. I've not researched this because, to be honest, this is about historical details that probably can't be answered, and as a Christian and as a scientist, this is not really that interesting to me in terms of my faith, or things that I think listeners would be interested in particularly either. But I did have a brainwave at lunchtime today after I had been reading other commentaries about what could be a simple interpretation of verse 2. Namely, if the underlying Greek word for census, which has been translated as taxed, if there is that ambiguity, then maybe simply the word taxed is being used in two different ways here. So in verse 1, the word taxed is being used to mean registered for a census. And then we see in verse 2 that there's a very natural meaning then, if it's essentially saying, and later on the first actual taxation occurred when Cyrenius was governor of Syria, meaning after AD 6. So the census occurred around the time of the birth of Jesus, which is 4 BC, we believe, and it would be approximately 10 years later, when Cyrenius was governor of Syria, that the first use of that census was made to tax the people, and namely create enormous unrest and leading to insurrections. So if it's possible that that underlying Greek word can have these dual meanings of registration and actual taxation, then I think there is no mystery here whatsoever. It's just perhaps a slightly confusing form of writing, but it's perfectly understandable. In any case, we will move on. So according to the form of the census, everyone had to go to the city of his family heritage. Now we know from Matthew, and we're also going to see a lineage later in Luke, that Joseph is from the lineage of David. And David, the most famous king in Jewish history, King David, was born and raised in Bethlehem. And Bethlehem, a small town about 6 miles from Jerusalem, and the underlying Hebrew means house of bread. Now, interestingly, the prophecies regarding the emergence of the Messiah include a prophecy from the prophet Micah, which indicates that the prophet will come from Bethlehem. And so this census, taking Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem, is in a sense divine providence. If you are a cynic and a critic, you would say, well, Luke has to write it in such a way that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. But if we believe in the integrity of Luke, it's worth pointing out that critics of Luke in the 1st and 2nd centuries who were not Christians and were criticizing the gospel, did not pick up any problems with this opening of chapter 2, and they perhaps would have been quite well versed in relatively recent history of the region. So I think we have good reason historically to believe that Luke is writing things that are informing our history rather than can be shot down by rather fragmented history we have from others. In any case, this prophecy from Micah is in the book of Micah towards the end of the Old Testament, chapter 5 and verse 2. And we have the following: But thou, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting. So relating there to the emergence of the Messiah and indicating that figure will emerge from Bethlehem. It's worth pointing out that the house of David, so the lineage of David, had been torn apart over the millennium between David's reign and the time we're speaking of here, around the time of the birth of Jesus Christ. As the pulpit commentary states, the house of David had been dismembered, conquered, and devastated, and comprised of a sort of scattered population of people who were not powerful and sometimes very humble, and that explains perhaps that Joseph is a carpenter, his wife Mary possibly an orphan, a destitute orphan. So these are not powerful people in the house of David, but they need to go to Bethlehem in order to register for the census. So in verse 5 then, we just remember that taxed here is registered, to be registered with his espoused wife being great with child. Now, here we know from Matthew, the other nativity story where we're introduced to Joseph and Mary, a rather candid detail, and that is in Matthew chapter 1, verse 25. And we have here, in fact, I'll read the preceding verse. This is when the angel comes to Joseph. Then Joseph, being raised from sleep, did as the angel of the Lord had bidden him, and took unto him his wife, and knew her not till she had brought forth her firstborn son, and he called his name Jesus. So there, as the angel had previously instructed Joseph that Mary's conception was an immaculate conception, that he should have no fear for her faithfulness, but that he should not know her, namely have intimate relationship with her until the birth of the child. And here, espoused wife, presumably, it's not absolutely clear from reading the commentaries, but I would say almost certainly they would have to have been married, otherwise presumably it would be scandalous for them to be travelling together with her 9 months pregnant. That's okay in the late 20th and early 21st century, but for most of history, and particularly around this time in Palestine, one cannot imagine that being tolerated, to be quite frank. So presumably they're married, but their marriage has not been consummated. And Mary is great with child, so she is close to the time of being in childbirth. And we have these verses which, to anyone who's grown up in the Western world, particularly where we have a sort of, certainly in America and Great Britain, which I'm used to, we often have in schools children enacting the Nativity, and it's sort of a combination of the stories of the three kings from the Book of Matthew and the Gospel of Matthew, and the soon to come shepherds that we'll see in the next couple of readings in Luke. But there's often a child is chosen to read out some of these verses, and so when I read these verses, I am just taken back to both my own childhood and also my children's nativities that they acted at school, listening to them and their friends giving the narration and acting out the scenes. Always very heartwarming to watch. So in verse 6, that they're in Bethlehem, and we learn the days were accomplished. She has gone into labour, and she brought forth her firstborn son. Now, loaded phrase that, because our first thought is, does that mean that Mary had future children, and that Jesus actually had essentially half brothers and half sisters, because her future children would have Joseph as the father? Now, of course, within Catholicism, Mary is described as the Virgin Mary, and there is a very clear view that Mary remained a virgin. Firstborn can absolutely just be interpreted as meaning her first child. It doesn't have to imply that there are any future children. But it also has a rather intuitive meaning that it was the first of successive children. Again, we don't have any historical precision with this, and different Christians will have different thoughts and beliefs on whether Jesus had half brothers and sisters. We learn often about his brethren in the Gospels, and these are sometimes thought to be stepbrothers, maybe from a prior marriage of Joseph, or cousins from a sister or brother of Mary's. In any case, Jesus, the infant Jesus, has been born of Mary in Bethlehem. And in the language of John, one might say that the creative force, Logos, has been made manifest in the world through embryonic growth in Mary, and now born as a newborn infant. And he is wrapped in swaddling clothes, and this was absolutely typical for the Jewish people of that time, that the newborn was washed, apparently rubbed with salt, although I don't know if that was done here, and then wrapped up very tight in blankets, presumably to keep him warm, because they're not in a house. They are essentially in some form of stable or somewhere where you might keep livestock, because there was no room for them in the inn. Now, some nice historical information here from commentators. The inn, so to speak, would be known as a khan, Khan, and it would be a stone building with a courtyard, and it would have very small rooms leading off from the courtyard where essentially you could just get shelter. So it would not be a luxurious place, but it's absolutely chock-a-block, stock full because of the census. It probably would have some form of structure attached to it for the animals that maybe brought people to the khan, and this is where probably others along with Joseph and Mary are staying overnight. And it's interesting to think that, why wasn't there accommodation made for a woman in labour? But there wasn't. Whether that was because Joseph and Mary are so humble and so lowly that they're simply not worth giving a room to, or maybe they couldn't afford a room. Because, of course, when things are very popular, when you have events in a town, hotel rates go through the roof, and it would have been no different back then. The infant Jesus is laid in a manger, so would be some small sort of trough that's in that stable or similar structure, maybe something that was used for food for the animals. And there we have the first part of the Nativity as related by Luke, and in the next reading or two we will have these beautiful scenes emerging regarding the shepherds, but also something that's not normally covered in nativity stories is the circumcision of Jesus in Jerusalem, and some very glorious events that occur there in this chapter. Just one final point, the fact that Jesus is born in such meagre circumstances and his parents really, in enormous discomfort, most likely, particularly poor Mary, giving birth in essentially a stable. But it does seem to indicate that Joseph did not have living family or connections in Bethlehem that could have essentially accommodated them. So even though he's of the line of David, it's not likely from this account that he had moved to Nazareth from Bethlehem in recent years, because if he had, he would have had friends and family there who could have helped him and Mary. So it seems to imply that he has been living in Nazareth for a very long time.